I am Aisha, 35 years old, and I just woke up from a grueling 4-hour endometriosis surgery to find a $5,000 cashier's check resting on my hospital tray. My mother-in-law, Vivian, stood over my bed adjusting the designer pearls I had paid for and smirked. I sold that rotting cabin of yours. The family needed the cash, and honestly, Aisha, you do not deserve it. I stared at the forged documents she tossed beside the check. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a toxic family to protect your peace. Because what Vivian did not know was that I was about to laugh so hard, my heart monitor would trigger an alarm. She had absolutely no idea what she had just sold. The anesthesia was still a thick, heavy fog in my brain, making the fluorescent lights of the recovery room harsh and disorienting. My lower abdomen throbbed with a deep, grinding ache. I had just undergone a major excision surgery, a procedure I had been waiting 6 months to have, hoping to finally get my life back from chronic pain. I expected to wake up to the sight of my husband Terrence sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl visitor chair holding my hand and telling me everything went perfectly. I expected the man who vowed to protect me to actually be there when I was at my most vulnerable. Instead, I woke up to the overpowering scent of Vivian's signature floral perfume, a smell that had haunted my marriage from day one. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask what the surgeon had said about my recovery time or if I needed water. She simply stood at the foot of my hospital bed, her posture rigid and triumphant, holding a pristine manila envelope. "Terrence is grabbing coffee down in the cafeteria," she announced, completely unprompted, acting as if we were having a casual chat in her living room. "He has had a very stressful morning waiting on you to wake up, so I told him to take a well-deserved break." I blinked, trying to force my eyes to focus on her face. "Where is my husband, Vivian?" I asked, my voice dry and raspy, scraping against my throat. "Get him in here." She ignored my request completely, stepping closer to drop the envelope directly onto my lap. The sharp corner poked my hand, but it was the cashier's check sliding out that caught my attention. It was made out to me for $5,000. "What is this?" I asked, confusion warring with the medication still pumping through my veins. "You're cut," she said, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of supreme satisfaction. The pearls around her neck gleamed under the harsh hospital lights. Those were the exact same pearls Terrence had gifted her for Mother's Day, purchased with my business credit card, because his personal checking account was overdrawn again. "I sold that rotting lake house your grandfather left you. Jamal needs capital for his new crypto investment firm, and you have been entirely too selfish hoarding a property you barely even visit. The family needed the cash, and honestly, Aisha, you do not deserve to sit on that kind of money while your brother-in-law struggles to get his life together." The words hit me, but my groggy brain struggled to process the sheer unadulterated audacity of what she was saying. The lake house. It was not just a cabin. It was 50 acres of ancestral land in upstate New York purchased by my great-grandfather 3 generations ago. It was the land where my grandfather taught me how to fish, where my family held our summer cookouts for decades, where I learned the value of owning something nobody could ever take away from us. It was my heritage. "You cannot sell property you do not own," I managed to say, pushing myself up against the pillows, despite the searing pain ripping through my stomach muscles. "My name is on the deed. You have lost your mind if you think this is a joke." Vivian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, shaking her head as if I were a slow child. "Oh, please. You act like you are the only one who knows how to handle paperwork. Terrence is your husband. He has your medical proxy while you are in here incapacitated. He signed off on the transfer to help his brother. That is what a real family does. We uplift each other. A strong Black woman like you is supposed to support her family, not act like you are better than everyone else, just because you run some little design agency." My little design agency was a highly successful user experience firm that brought in 90% of our household income. It paid the mortgage on the luxury townhouse Terrence and I shared. It paid for the pearls currently resting against Vivian's collarbone. It paid for the very hospital room we were standing in. And Jamal Vivian's golden child was a 30-year-old man who had failed at 5 different business ventures in the last 4 years, always expecting Terrence to bail him out and always blaming everyone else for his lack of work ethic. I looked down at the $5,000 check resting on the sterile white blanket. They had sold 50 acres of prime generational real estate to fund an absolute scam, and they thought tossing me $5,000 would keep me quiet. They thought I would just swallow my pride, accept the disrespect, and keep funding their lifestyle, because I was conditioned to keep the peace. Get out! I whispered, my vision suddenly becoming crystal clear. The fog of the anesthesia evaporated entirely under the heat of pure, unfiltered rage. Excuse me? Vivian's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. I reached over with my uninjured hand and ripped the medical tape securing the IV line to my wrist. The sudden sharp sting grounded me in reality. I said, "Get out of my room, Vivian. Get out right now before I call security and have you physically escorted out for harassing a recovering patient." "You are completely unhinged," she scoffed, taking a step back as I slammed my hand onto the nurse call button, pressing it repeatedly. "Terrence warned me you would be dramatic about this. This is exactly why he did not want to be in the room when I told you the news. You have never respected my position in this family. You should be thanking me for handling this burden for you while you were asleep." I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying was for victims, and I was entirely done playing that role. I picked up the forged sale documents she had left on the bed. My eyes scanned the buyer information. It was a limited liability company. Not just any company, but one I recognized immediately. I stared at the signature line. It was a crude, obvious forgery of my name, notarized by a stamp I knew for a fact did not belong to a legitimate official. As the nurse rushed into the room, looking panicked at the sound of the alarm, I was triggering. Vivian snatched up her designer handbag from the visitor chair. "You will calm down and realize this is for the best," Vivian sneered from the doorway, trying to maintain her posture in front of the medical staff. "We are family, Aisha. You need to learn your place and accept that Terrence made a decision as the head of your household." She turned on her heel and walked out, the arrogant click of her shoes echoing down the hospital corridor. The nurse rushed to my side, her hands flying to check my monitors and examine my IV line. "Ma'am, your heart rate is extremely elevated. Are you experiencing severe pain? Should I page the surgical team?" I looked from the frantic nurse to the forged deed in my hand, and then to the $5,000 check resting on my lap. The sheer monumental stupidity of what my spineless husband and my controlling mother-in-law had just done washed over me in a massive wave. They actually thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had stolen my heritage for a quick payday to hand over to the golden child, assuming I would just bow my head and take the loss. A sound bubbled up deep in my chest. It started as a low chuckle catching painfully in my sore abdomen and quickly grew into a full, uncontrollable laugh. The nurse backed away slightly, looking genuinely alarmed as my laughter echoed off the walls of the sterile hospital room. The heart monitor beeped faster and faster, matching the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "I am fine," I gasped out between laughs, waving the concerned nurse off as I wiped a tear of pure amusement from my eye. "I am perfectly fine. I just need my discharge papers immediately." Because what Vivian and Terrence did not know, what they could not possibly have known, because they never bothered to ask about the legalities of my grandfather's estate, was that they had not just committed federal wire fraud and blatant forgery. They had sold a property that was legally impossible to touch. They had just dug their own graves, and they had proudly handed me the shovel. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, my fingers moving with a precision that belied the pain shooting through my abdomen. I hit Terrence's contact, the photo of us smiling on our honeymoon in Jamaica, mocking me from the screen. It rang 4 times before he picked up. The background noise was unmistakable, the clinking of expensive glassware, the low hum of a high-end restaurant, and Jamal's booming laugh. "Aisha." "Hey, baby," Terrence whispered, his voice dripping with that placating tone he used whenever he knew he was about to get caught in a lie. I am just grabbing a quick bite. My mother said you were resting comfortably. Resting comfortably? I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. Your mother just walked into my recovery room, dropped a $5,000 check on my lap, and announced she sold my grandfather's lake house. And she said you signed off on it. Tell me she is lying, Terrence. Tell me you did not forge my signature on a deed while I was under anesthesia. Terrence sighed, a long, dramatic sound designed to make me feel unreasonable. Aisha, keep your voice down. You are overreacting. It is not a forgery, it is a medical proxy. I am your husband. I have the legal right to make decisions for our household when you are incapacitated. Incapacitated, I snapped, gripping the edge of the hospital bed. I was having endometriosis surgery, Terrence, not a lobotomy. A medical proxy gives you the right to authorize a blood transfusion, not sell 50 acres of my ancestral land. He shushed me again, the sound grating against every nerve I had left. Look, Jamal finally found a solid investment opportunity. This crypto firm is a sure thing. We needed liquidity fast, and you have been sitting on that rotting cabin for years doing nothing with it. You are a strong black woman, Aisha. You make great money with your agency. You are supposed to be uplifting this family, not hoarding assets while your own brother-in-law struggles to get off the ground. Uplifting the family. The sheer audacity of his words tasted like ash in my mouth. Jamal is 30 years old, Terrence. His last solid investment opportunity was a premium sneaker reselling business that ended with him owing $30,000 to a loan shark, which I paid off. My grandfather worked 3 jobs in the Jim Crow South to buy that land, and you sold it to fund a scam. Who did you even find to buy it that fast? Terrence hesitated, the background noise swelling for a moment before he covered the receiver. It was a private buyer, he muttered evasively. A limited liability company. They paid $300,000 cash. Above market value for that area, honestly. You should be thanking us for getting rid of that tax burden. $300,000 for 50 acres of prime lakefront property. They had practically given it away. Who was the buyer, Terrence? I demanded, my voice cold and hard. I am looking at the paperwork right now. Who owns Lakeside Development? LLC. He groaned, the sound of a man annoyed that his wife was demanding basic accountability. Doesn't matter. The deal is done. The money is transferred. Just accept the $5,000 cut my mother generously gave you. It matters because I am going to sue them, I shot back. Who is it? Fine, Terrence snapped, losing his forced patience. It was Greg. Okay, Keisha's husband. He has been looking for a new development project and he offered cash. He is keeping the property in the family. You should be happy. Greg. Keisha's arrogant old money-white husband. The man who had spent every Thanksgiving for the last 5 years making snide comments about how my family's property was a wasted asset because we had not bulldozed the natural springs to build luxury condos. The man who looked down his nose at Terrence and Jamal, treating them like charity cases while he used his generational wealth to buy up property across the state. Greg had not kept it in the family. He had stolen it for pennies on the dollar because he knew Terrence was too spineless to challenge him and Vivian was too desperate to fund Jamal's delusions. You sold my grandfather's legacy to Greg. I stated, the reality settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Terrence lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. Aisha, listen to me very carefully. You are embarrassing yourself. The paperwork is filed. The money is in Jamal's account. You need to calm down, accept the check, and respect my mother's financial decisions. If you cannot do that, if you are going to keep throwing this tantrum, I am not coming to pick you up from the hospital today. You can find your own way home. The threat hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to reassert control. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg him to come get me, to apologize for being difficult, just so I would not have to navigate the city alone after major surgery. I looked at the $5,000 check on my tray table. I looked at the IV line I had already removed. Enjoy your lunch, Terrence, I said, my voice eerily calm. Make sure you get the steak. You are going to need the protein. Going to. I hung up before he could respond. I did not cry. I reached over and hit the call button for the nurse. When she hurried in looking anxious, I was already swinging my legs over the side of the bed. Bring me my discharge papers, I told her, wincing as my abdominal muscles pulled tight. I am leaving. Today. The memory of the 4th of July cookout 3 months ago suddenly flashed in my mind, the pieces of their betrayal clicking into place with sickening clarity. I needed to get out of this hospital. I needed to get to my laptop. And most importantly, I needed to make a phone call that was going to turn Greg's $300,000 steal into the biggest financial disaster of his life. The sharp smell of rubbing alcohol in the hospital corridor faded as I waited for the elevator, replaced in my memory by the thick, heavy scent of hickory wood smoke and barbecue. 3 months ago, the annual 4th of July cookout at Vivian's house. That was when the seed for this entire betrayal was planted. I should have seen it coming the moment Jamal pulled up to the driveway in a leased luxury SUV he absolutely could not afford. The backyard had been packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins playing spades at folding tables. R&B music was playing loudly from a portable speaker. I was standing near the grill, turning a batch of hot links, minding my own business. Vivian had spent the entire afternoon throwing passive-aggressive shade my way. She criticized the potato salad I brought and loudly bragged to her church friends about how Keisha married a man who actually provides, completely ignoring the fact that I was the primary breadwinner in my own marriage. Then came the ambush. Vivian marched over to the grill, flanked by Jamal, who was wearing designer sunglasses and holding a red plastic cup. Terrence trailed behind them, his head down, already looking like a beaten dog, avoiding eye contact. Vivian did not even bother with small talk. She leaned in, her voice pitched low enough to keep the church ladies from hearing, but loud enough to make sure I felt the pressure. Jamal has a massive opportunity, Aisha. A crypto investment firm. It is guaranteed to triple its returns in 6 months, but the bank is being unreasonable about the startup loan. They need collateral. I kept my eyes on the grill, flipping a hot link. And what does that have to do with me? I asked. Jamal stepped forward, flashing that slick, empty smile he used to hustle people out of their money. Come on, sis. You have that 50 acres sitting upstate doing absolutely nothing. We just need you to put the deed up as collateral. I will have the loan paid off before Christmas. You will not lose a thing, and the family builds generational wealth. Win-win. I actually laughed out loud. The sheer disrespect of asking me to risk my grandfather's legacy on a cryptocurrency scam was staggering. Jamal, I said, looking him dead in the eye. The last time you tried to build generational wealth, you started a premium sneaker resale business and ended up owing $30,000 to a man named Big Mike. I paid that off so they would not break your legs. The answer is absolutely not. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. You selfish, arrogant girl, you are supposed to be family. We are supposed to uplift each other. I turned to my husband, waiting for him to step in and shut his mother and brother down. Terrence just took a slow sip of his beer and shrugged. Just hear them out, babe, he mumbled, looking down at his shoes. It is a good business plan. We have to support the family. Before I could tear Terrence apart for his cowardice, a new voice entered the conversation. It was Greg, Keisha's wealthy, arrogant white husband. He strolled over in his expensive linen shirt, holding a craft beer he had brought himself, because he refused to drink what Vivian served. Greg always carried himself with the smug entitlement of a man who was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. Actually, Aisha, you really do not understand the market, Greg said, swirling the beer in his glass. He looked at me with a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. That land is a completely wasted asset. You have 50 acres of prime waterfront property, and it is just sitting there growing weeds. No development, no subdivision, no revenue generation. It is financially irresponsible. If you knew anything about real estate, you would leverage it. I stared at Greg, feeling the heat from the grill matching the heat rising in my chest. My grandfather bought that land when banks would not even look at a black man, Greg. It is not a wasted asset. It is my heritage. And it is not for sale, not for leverage, and certainly not for your amusement. Greg chuckled, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. Heritage does not pay the bills, Aisha. The zoning laws up there are shifting. Someone with actual capital could turn that dirt into a gold mine, a luxury resort, maybe a gated community. But you do not have the vision for that, do you? I shut Jamal down loudly, making sure the entire yard heard me tell him he would never touch a single blade of grass on my property. Vivian stormed off embarrassed, and Terrence followed her like a shadow. But as I walked away to get a glass of water, I glanced back. Greg was not watching the argument anymore. He was staring intently at his phone. I walked up behind him just close enough to see the screen. He was looking at a topographical map of my grandfather's property, zooming in on the property lines and the natural springs. The memory faded as I stepped out of the hospital automatic doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. I flagged down a passing taxi, carefully lowering myself into the back seat. I hissed in pain, gripping the armrest as the car hit a pothole, but my mind was racing with razor-sharp clarity. Greg had not just been making condescending conversation at that cookout. He had been scouting. He had seen an opportunity to grab 50 acres of prime real estate from a family he clearly thought was ignorant and easily manipulated. He knew Terrence was weak. He knew Vivian was desperate for cash to fund Jamal. And he assumed I was just a naive woman who did not know the true value of what she owned. I pulled my phone from my purse. The anesthesia was completely gone now, replaced by cold, calculated adrenaline. I opened the web browser and navigated directly to the state's public property records portal. If Greg had used an LLC to buy the land from Vivian, there would be a public trail. I typed in Lakeside Development LLC, the name Terrence had foolishly let slip during our phone call. The search results populated instantly. Greg was listed as the sole managing member. But it was the financial filings attached to the LLC that made me sit up straight, ignoring the sharp pull of my surgical stitches. Greg had not just bought the fraudulent deed from Vivian for $300,000. He had immediately used that deed to secure a massive commercial development loan. My eyes scanned the digital document. $2 million. He had leveraged his own company to take out a $2 million high-interest loan from a private commercial lender, explicitly citing the construction of a luxury eco-resort on my grandfather's land. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as the taxi sped toward my townhouse. Greg was arrogant, but he was also greedy. He had moved with reckless speed, eager to lock down the funding and start digging before anyone could challenge the sale. He had probably pushed the paperwork through his own shady title contacts, skipping the necessary due diligence, because he thought he was pulling one over on his clueless in-laws. He thought he had just secured the deal of a lifetime. He thought he was untouchable. A harsh, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked out the window at the passing city streets. Greg just put $2 million of borrowed money on the line for a piece of land he legally could not touch. He was planning to bring bulldozers to a property that was strictly protected by the state government. And Vivian had committed federal wire fraud to make it happen. They did not just steal a house. They had walked right into a financial landmine, and I was holding the detonator. The taxi pulled up to the curb of the upscale brick townhouse I had purchased 3 years ago. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk, clutching my abdomen as a fresh wave of post-surgical pain washed over me. I had put down the $80,000 deposit for this house using profits from my design agency. I chose the neighborhood, I picked out the custom mahogany front door, and I paid the mortgage every single month on the first. Terrence liked to call it our home when he was showing off to his friends, but his financial contribution barely covered the utility bills. I walked up the front steps, moving slowly to protect my stitches, and slid my key into the brass deadbolt. It did not turn. I pulled the key out, wiped a smudge of dirt from the grooves, and pushed it back in. The metallic click was completely wrong. The cylinder had been replaced. I stared at the lock, my mind racing to catch up with the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. They had not just sold my grandfather's land while I was under anesthesia. They had rushed to a hardware store, bought new locks, and installed them on my front door before I even woke up in the recovery room. A sharp blue light suddenly illuminated the rim of the doorbell camera mounted next to the frame. The speaker crackled to life, emitting a burst of static, followed by my husband's voice. I thought you might discharge yourself early, Terrence said. His voice echoed through the small speaker, dripping with a smug, artificial confidence. He sounded emboldened, brave only because he was safely locked inside the house I paid for, staring at me through a wide-angle lens. "Open my door, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. I looked directly into the camera lens, refusing to let him see how much physical pain I was in. "It is our door, Aisha," he corrected, though his voice wavered slightly under my stare. "And right now, this house needs peace. My mother was deeply traumatized by your behavior at the hospital today. You were completely hysterical and disrespectful. I just had organs excised from my body 4 hours ago." "Terrence," I stated, gripping the iron railing to steady my shaking legs. "You let your mother forge my signature on a deed to steal my ancestral land, and you are telling me I was disrespectful. Open the door right now before I call the police and have them break it down." I heard a sudden sharp bark of laughter in the background of the audio feed. It was not Vivian. It was Keisha, Terrence's sister, the one married to Greg. "Tell her to go stay at a motel until she acts right," Keisha yelled from somewhere inside my living room. "Strong, independent black women do not need a man's house anyway. Let her sleep on a cot until she learns how to respect the family." Mama finally put her in her place. The absolute hypocrisy of Keisha sitting on my imported Italian leather sofa, drinking my wine and mocking my independence, while she lived her entire life funded by Greg's old money trust fund, was almost poetic. They were literally having a post-heist celebration inside my home, while I stood on the porch bleeding through my surgical bandages. "Nobody is calling the police," Terrence said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You are making a fool of yourself out there, Aisha. The neighbors can hear you. You can come inside and sleep in your own bed when you agree to drop this ridiculous attitude. You need to respect my mother's financial decisions and apologize to Jamal for making a scene." I stared at the little glowing blue circle. He was trying to break me. Terrence had always used silent treatments and passive-aggressive lockouts to assert dominance because he lacked any actual power in our relationship. He thought stripping me of my physical space, humiliating me in front of his sister, and leaving me stranded on the street after major surgery would force me to surrender. He thought I would cry, bang on the wood, and beg for forgiveness just to get out of the pain. "Greg wants you to sign a retroactive consent form for the $5,000 check." Terrence continued, revealing the true motive behind the lockout. "It just makes the sale completely clean for the title company. You sign the paper, you apologize to my mother, and I will unlock the door." Greg was getting nervous. He wanted a signature to cover up Vivian's blatant forgery because his $2 million development loan was riding on the legitimacy of that deed. They needed me to validate their crime, and they were using my home as leverage to extort me. The old Aisha might have cried. The old Aisha might have panicked at the thought of being locked out, desperately trying to keep the peace and fix a marriage that was clearly rotting from the inside out. But the woman standing on that porch had just shed the last remaining ounce of patience she possessed. I leaned forward until my face filled the camera frame. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. The quiet, deadpan delivery of my next words was far more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. "Terrence," I said, steadily enunciating every single syllable so the microphone would pick it up perfectly. "You have exactly 48 hours to find a very good lawyer." I turned on my heel and walked right back down the brick steps. I did not look back. I did not hesitate. I pulled out my phone and requested a premium black car service standing tall on the sidewalk until the sleek SUV pulled up to the curb. I slid into the leather back seat and gave the driver the address to the most exclusive 5-star luxury hotel in the downtown district. If Terrence wanted to play financial warfare, I was going to show him what an actual war chest looked like. 30 minutes later, I walked through the towering glass doors of the Grand Hotel lobby. I must have looked like a complete disaster wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a loose t-shirt over my surgical binders, but I held my head high and slapped my heavy corporate card down on the polished marble reception desk. "I need your best available penthouse suite," I told the concierge. "Indefinitely." Once I was safely inside the sprawling soundproof suite overlooking the city skyline, the adrenaline finally began to crash. I carefully lowered myself onto the edge of the plush king-sized bed, wincing as my muscles protested the movement. I unzipped the hidden interior pocket of my handbag and pulled out a small prepaid burner phone. I had purchased it 3 months ago, right after the 4th of July cookout, the exact day I realized my in-laws were actively plotting against my assets. I turned the device on. It only had one contact saved in the directory. I did not even have to press dial before the screen lit up with an incoming call from that exact number. I answered it, holding the cold plastic to my ear. Aisha, the deep, sophisticated voice on the other end said. It was Julian, my late grandfather's fiercely loyal real estate attorney, and one of the most ruthless legal minds in the state. He hated Greg and Vivian with a passion that almost rivaled my own. Julian's voice was currently trembling with suppressed, triumphant laughter. I was beginning to worry you would not get out of the hospital in time to hear the good news, he said. I am out, Julian, I replied, staring at the panoramic view of the city through the suite windows. And I am locked out of my townhouse. Terrence and Keisha are currently throwing a victory party in my living room. Julian let out a sharp, dark chuckle. Let them celebrate, Aisha. Let them drink your wine and toast to their brilliant real estate hustle. Because I am looking at the county clerk's digital registry right now. I held my breath, ignoring the ache in my stomach. Did they do it? They did it. Julian confirmed, the satisfaction radiating through the speaker. The county clerk just processed the deed transfer an hour ago. Vivian officially filed the forged signature across state lines, and Greg's limited liability company officially recorded the fraudulent purchase. Greg just tied his $2 million commercial loan to a piece of paper that is not worth the ink printed on it. I closed my eyes, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. Aisha, Julian continued, his tone turning razor sharp. Greg and Vivian took the bait completely. They have absolutely no idea what is buried in the public trust records. They have no idea what you already did to that land. I opened my eyes, the reflection of my own fierce expression catching in the hotel window glass. Let them enjoy the weekend, Julian. Because come Monday morning, I am going to burn their entire world to the ground. Julian was waiting for me in a private alcove of the hotel lounge when I came downstairs. He had a thick leather briefcase resting on the mahogany table between us. Julian had been my grandfather's attorney for 30 years. A brilliant legal mind who fought tooth and nail to help Black families in our community keep their generational wealth. He viewed my grandfather's 50 acres not just as real estate, but as a hard-won victory. When I sat down across from him, his eyes were sharp with a mixture of pride and predatory anticipation. He opened the briefcase and slid a heavy stack of watermarked documents toward me. They took the bait completely. Julian said, his voice steady and low. Vivian filed the paperwork using the old deed copy she must have dug out of your basement files. The one that was voided 5 years ago. I touched the edge of the real documents in front of me. 6 months ago, right after that disastrous 4th of July cookout, where Greg practically drooled over the property lines, I knew I had to protect my heritage. I did not argue with Terrence or complain to Vivian. I quietly went to Julian and transferred the active legal deed of the lake house into a blind trust. I made myself the sole beneficiary and trustee. But I did not stop there. The true value of that land was not the dirt on the surface. It was the natural, pristine freshwater springs running deep underneath it. I reached out to the State Conservation Board. After a thorough environmental assessment, they offered me $3.5 million for the permanent development and water rights to those 50 acres. I took the deal immediately. The money was securely sitting in an offshore high-yield account attached to my trust, and the land was permanently designated as a protected ecological site. It could never be subdivided, it could never be paved over, and it absolutely could never be turned into a luxury commercial resort. Vivian had no idea. She thought she was so clever digging through my home office while I was at work, stealing an outdated, worthless piece of paper and forging my signature. She thought she was ripping off a naive woman who did not understand business. And Greg was even worse. Armed with his trust fund arrogance and absolute certainty that he was the smartest man in the room, Greg did not bother doing a proper title search. He looked at me, a black woman running a design agency, and assumed I was sitting on a gold mine out of sheer ignorance. He thought he was swooping in to steal prime real estate for a measly $300,000. He was so blinded by his own privilege and greed that he rushed the closing process through his own shady title contacts just to secure the land before I woke up from surgery. Greg is officially the proud owner of a fraudulent deed to a federally protected wetland, Julian said, taking a sip of his black coffee. He just leveraged his entire development company to take out a $2 million commercial loan against an asset he legally cannot touch. The moment he alters that land, he is violating state and federal conservation laws. I leaned back against the plush velvet chair, the physical pain in my abdomen entirely masked by the sheer thrill of the trap snapping shut. "And Vivian?" I asked. "Vivian committed federal wire fraud," Julian replied, his tone turning deadly serious. "She forged a legal document and used it to facilitate a $300,000 wire transfer across state lines into Jamal's bank account. The authorities handle cases like that, Aisha. She is looking at serious time in a federal prison." The reality of their situation was staggering. Terrence had locked me out of my own house to defend a federal crime. He threw away our marriage to protect his mother and brother, thinking they had just secured generational wealth. Instead, they had secured their own financial and legal ruin. Jamal's crypto business would collapse the second the authorities froze his accounts. Vivian would face a judge for forgery and fraud. And Greg, the man who constantly belittled my family's history, was about to face a $2 million default that would bankrupt him and humiliate him in front of his wealthy investors. Julian reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table, his expression tightening. "There is one more thing you need to see. This just came across my desk an hour ago." I picked up the paper. It was a copy of an expedited state permit. "Greg is not wasting any time," Julian explained, watching my face closely. He pulled a rapid generic residential permit, completely bypassing the Environmental Review Board because his fraudulent deed does not show the conservation easements. He invited all of his major investors out to the lake house for a groundbreaking ceremony tomorrow morning. He wants to show off his new luxury resort location. I stared at the permit. Greg was actually going to bring heavy machinery onto protected land. He was hosting a party to celebrate stealing my grandfather's legacy, surrounded by my treacherous in-laws, who were undoubtedly treating this like a family victory. Julian leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "The state conservation officers do not know about his event yet. As your attorney, I can file an emergency injunction right now. We can have a judge halt the ceremony, freeze Greg's assets, and stop the bulldozers before they even arrive at the site." "Do we stop him, Aisha?" I looked down at the permit, then out the window at the bustling city streets. I thought about Terrence telling me to respect his mother's financial decisions. I thought about Keisha laughing in my living room, telling me to sleep on a cot. I thought about Greg sneering at me, calling my heritage a wasted asset. They wanted to play games with my grandfather's land. They wanted to bulldoze my history to build a monument to their own greed. I placed the permit back on the table and looked Julian dead in the eye. I smiled, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calculated resolve. "No," I said softly. "Let him start the engines." The morning sun hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite was beautiful, but the aggressive vibrating of my burner phone on the nightstand shattered the peace instantly. It was Sunday morning. I carefully rolled over, my core muscles tight and aching from the surgery, and picked up the device. I had 42 unread messages. They were from women in my sorority chapter, old family friends and members of the massive congregation Terrence and his mother attended every single week. I opened a message from my best friend Chloe, who sang in the choir there. She had sent a voice note, and her tone was a mix of absolute shock and protective rage. Aisha Chloe hissed through the speaker, "You need to know what Vivian just did." She took the microphone during the prayer request portion of the service. She stood up in front of 2,000 people, manufactured premium tears, and told the entire church that you had suffered a severe mental breakdown after your surgery. She said you abandoned Terrence, ran off to hide in a hotel, and were actively trying to bankrupt the family out of pure, unmedicated spite. Keisha was standing right next to her on the altar, nodding sadly and passing her tissues. They literally asked the pastor to pray for your troubled soul. I set the phone down on the mattress. Vivian was weaponizing the pulpit. She knew exactly what she was doing. In our community, controlling the church narrative was half the battle. If she painted me as the unstable, bitter black woman who lost her mind and abandoned her devoted husband, no one would question why they had to step in and sell my property to survive my supposed financial abuse. It was a preemptive strike. She was laying the groundwork to cover up her federal wire fraud by discrediting my sanity before I could even file a police report. She wanted the community to look at me with pity and dismiss any truth I spoke as the ramblings of a sick woman. Before I could even process the sheer calculated evil of that performance, a text message from Terrence dropped down from the top of my screen. It was an image file. I clicked it open and the breath caught in my throat. It was a screenshot of our shared household checking account. The balance read $0.00. I blinked, tracing the transaction history on the screen. A wire transfer for exactly $15,000 had been initiated at 8 in the morning, right before he headed off to church to watch his mother assassinate my character. Another text popped up right beneath the image. Jamal's luxury Audi lease was 3 months past due, and they were threatening to repossess it this morning. I took care of my family. You can have access to the accounts again when you come home. Apologize to my mother for your behavior, and sign the retroactive consent forms for the lake house. This is what happens when you do not act like a wife. I stared at the glowing words. Terrence had emptied the account that paid our mortgage, our utilities, and our groceries to pay for his 30-year-old brother's luxury car. He was using financial starvation as a compliance tactic. He actually believed that holding $15,000 hostage was going to bring me to my knees. He thought he had just cut off my oxygen. He had absolutely no idea that the corporate accounts for my user experience design agency, which held mid-six figures and funded our entire lavish lifestyle, were completely separate and legally untouchable by him. He thought the household checking account was my safety net, not realizing it was just the petty cash drawer. But the sheer audacity of stealing the money I set aside to keep a roof over our heads to pay for Jamal's ego flipped a switch inside me. There was no sadness left. There was no grief for the man I thought I had married. The illusion of my husband was dead, replaced entirely by this weak, manipulative stranger who stole from his recovering wife to buy his mother's approval. I did not throw the phone. I did not type out a furious, emotional paragraph telling him how much he had hurt me. Emotional reactions were what they expected. They wanted me unhinged so they could point to my texts and validate their church narrative. Instead, I took a screenshot of his text message and backed it up to my secure cloud drive. I walked into the marble bathroom and washed my face. I carefully strapped my surgical compression garments into place, ignoring the sharp twinges of pain. I pulled a sharp-tailored crimson blazer from my luggage and slipped it on. I applied a bold, dark red lipstick, hiding any trace of the exhausted, betrayed patient they thought they were dealing with. I was putting on my armor. I walked out of the hotel and hailed a black car service to the financial district. I did not go to the police. I went to the sleek, glass-walled offices of Sylvia Caldwell. Sylvia was the most feared family law attorney in the city, a woman who ate arrogant, financially abusive men for breakfast and billed them heavily for the privilege. She had a reputation for leaving her opponents with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of regret. I bypassed her receptionist who tried to tell me I needed an appointment and walked straight into her corner office. Sylvia looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes taking in my crimson blazer and the cold, flat expression on my face. She knew immediately that this was not a social call. I dropped my phone onto her pristine glass desk. The screen was still brightly displaying Terrence's text message about taking the $15,000 to teach me how to act like a wife. Sylvia read the message. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped the edge of the desk once. She looked up at me, a dangerous professional smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, steady and absolute. I want him with nothing by Friday. Sylvia did not offer me a warm hug or a cup of herbal tea. She did not give me a pitying look or ask me how my surgical incisions were feeling. She simply picked up my phone, read the text message where my husband bragged about stealing my money to fund his brother's luxury lifestyle, and smiled a cold, predatory smile. She slid a sleek silver laptop across her massive glass desk and pushed a cup of black espresso toward me. Log in. Sylvia instructed, her fingers already flying across her own keyboard as she pulled up emergency injunction forms. If Terrence thinks $15,000 is a devastating financial blow, we are about to show him what an actual wealth transfer looks like. I want you to sever every digital tie he has to your agency right now. Terrence had always been incredibly arrogant, but his arrogance was matched only by his absolute financial ignorance. When my user experience design agency started bringing in serious revenue 2 years ago, he insisted on having a corporate card with his name on it. He claimed it was for networking and emergency business expenses, but we both knew it was just an ego trip. He wanted to pull out a heavy metal card at business lunches and pretend he was a titan of industry, completely ignoring the fact that my late nights, my client pitches, and my talent were funding the account. I had allowed it to keep the peace in our marriage, setting a reasonable limit and closely monitoring the transactions. But Terrence did not understand how corporate banking actually worked. He assumed that because we were married, he was legally entitled to unlimited access to my business capital. He did not realize that I had structured the agency as an S corporation long before our wedding. He was an authorized user on a single credit line, not a signatory on the primary operating accounts. And more importantly, the master administrative controls for the entire financial network required two-factor authentication linked directly to my personal cell phone. I typed my credentials into the banking portal, the pain in my abdomen completely overshadowed by the rush of taking back my power. I navigated to the user management dashboard. I found Terrence's profile. With one click, I revoked his corporate card. With a second click, I deleted his phone number from the security recovery options. Finally, I initiated a mass transfer of all my operational capital, mid-six figures of hard-earned money, into a newly formed secure trust account Sylvia had just opened for me. Within 4 minutes, Terrence was entirely locked out of my financial ecosystem. The $15,000 he had drained from our joint household account was officially the only money he had to his name. Sylvia watched the confirmation screens pop up and nodded sharply. I am filing an emergency ex parte motion with the family court as we speak, she said, her voice crisp and efficient. We are citing the dissipation of marital assets. Terrence took shared household funds to pay for a third-party vehicle lease. No judge in this state will look kindly on a man who steals from his wife while she is in a hospital recovery room. By the time he realizes he needs a lawyer, his legal standing will be completely pulverized. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, sipping the bitter espresso. For the first time in hours, I felt a genuine sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer the victim of a coordinated family ambush. I was the architect of their downfall. We sat in Sylvia's office for the next hour, finalizing the paperwork for my divorce petition and organizing the evidence of Vivian's forged deed for the federal authorities. The silence in the room was productive, heavy with strategy and focus. And then, right on schedule, my phone screen lit up. It was not a text message. It was an automated push notification from my banking app. Transaction declined. Capital Grill. $840. I set my coffee cup down, a slow smile spreading across my face. Sylvia looked up from her screen, raising one perfectly arched eyebrow. He is at a steakhouse, I told her, watching a second notification pop up on the screen. Transaction declined. Capital Grill, $840. Please contact your banking institution. He is treating them to a victory lunch. I continued, visualizing the scene perfectly. Terrence was sitting in a leather booth at one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city. Vivian was probably wearing her stolen pearls, sipping vintage champagne, celebrating her brilliant real estate hustle. Jamal was likely ordering the most expensive tomahawk steak on the menu, bragging about the crypto firm he was going to build with my grandfather's land. Terrence had called for the check, eager to play the big shot provider in front of his mother and brother. He had confidently dropped my corporate card into the leather folder, waiting for the waiter to return with a pen and a smile. A third notification flashed on my screen. Transaction declined. Card invalid. Account closed. I could see it happening in my mind. The waiter returning to the table, leaning down discreetly to inform Terrence that his card had been rejected. Vivian's smug smile faltering. Jamal looking away, suddenly deeply interested in his phone. Terrence's face flushing with hot, angry embarrassment as he patted his pockets, searching for another card, knowing full well his personal debit account was empty because he had used everything else to pay Jamal's car lease. My phone began to vibrate violently against the glass desk. The caller ID flashed Terrence's name. He was calling my actual phone, completely unaware that I had a secure burner tucked in my bag. Sylvia leaned back in her chair and gestured toward the device. Put him on speaker. I tapped the green button and set the phone in the center of the desk. Terrence, I said, keeping my voice light and completely unbothered. Aisha, stop playing games right now, Terrence hissed. His voice was a harsh, frantic whisper, echoing slightly. He was hiding in the restaurant bathroom or a quiet hallway, desperate to keep his family from hearing his panic. Unfreeze the corporate card immediately. The waiter has been to the table 3 times. You are making me look broke in front of my mother. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. You locked me out of my own home while I was bleeding through surgical bandages, Terrence. You told me to sleep on a cot until I learned how to respect your mother. Did you really think I was going to keep funding your lunch dates? Do not do this, Aisha, he pleaded, his anger masking a rising wave of sheer panic. I know you are mad about the lake house, but we can talk about that later. Right now, I need to pay this bill. My mother is sitting out there waiting. Jamal is making jokes. Just unlock the account. I will bring you the new house keys tonight. I promise. We will sit down and fix this like adults. He was trying to negotiate with leverage he no longer possessed. He thought he could trade access to my own front door for access to my bank accounts. I am not mad. Terrence, I replied, my tone dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. I am perfectly fine. And we are not going to talk about anything tonight because I am currently sitting in the office of my divorce attorney. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The bustling background noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away as the reality of my words hit him. Divorce, Aisha. You are being completely hysterical. You do not just throw away a marriage over a real estate dispute. You are not thinking clearly. Unfreeze the card right now so I can pay this bill and come get you. I looked at Sylvia. She gave me a single approving nod. The cards are not frozen, Terrence, I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. They are empty. You took your $15,000 this morning. That was your severance package. You are going to have to ask Jamal to pay for the steaks using the money your mother stole from me. Aisha, wait, he stammered, the panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. You cannot just leave me stranded here. By the way, I interrupted, checking the gold watch on my wrist. Greg's groundbreaking ceremony at the lake house starts in exactly 1 hour. You might want to figure out how to pay that waiter and get over there. It is going to be explosive. The drive upstate took almost 2 hours, giving me plenty of time to watch the disaster unfold in real time. I sat in the spacious back seat of the hired black SUV. My crimson blazer perfectly pressed my posture rigid, despite the surgical ache in my abdomen. I held my burner phone in my hand, watching a live video feed on social media. Keisha, in her desperate need to showcase her proximity to wealth and whiteness, was broadcasting Greg's groundbreaking ceremony to her entire follower list. She was doing a literal high-definition broadcast of their federal crime, and she was too blinded by her own ego to realize it. The camera panned across the property, and a fresh wave of protective anger washed over me. This was my grandfather's sanctuary. He had purchased these 50 acres during a time when black men were aggressively redlined out of every decent neighborhood in the state. He worked 3 grueling manual labor jobs, saving every wrinkled dollar bill to buy a piece of the earth that nobody could ever take away from him. It was land rich with thick green timber, wild wildflowers, and crystal clear natural springs that bubbled up from deep within the bedrock. It was a place of peace, a place where our family had gathered for generations to celebrate life and escape the heavy burdens of the world. Now it was completely desecrated by Greg's arrogant vanity. Through the screen of my phone, I watched as Keisha proudly showed off the setup. Massive, pristine white catering tents had been erected right over the exact patch of grass where my grandfather used to set up his old iron smoker. A pretentious string quartet was playing classical music in the corner. Crystal champagne flutes caught the afternoon sun resting on tables draped in heavy white linen. And there was Greg standing in the center of it all, wearing a tailored cream-colored linen suit holding court, with a group of older, wealthy white men in expensive loafers. I acquired it for absolute pennies, Greg boasted loudly, his voice easily picked up by Keisha's phone microphone. He took a sip of his imported champagne and chuckled. The family had absolutely no idea what they were sitting on. Completely financially illiterate. They were just letting this prime real estate rot. I practically did them a favor by taking it off their hands before the property taxes swallowed them whole. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. Greg was not just bragging about a real estate deal. He was openly mocking my family's intelligence to his wealthy investors, portraying himself as the brilliant savior who swooped in to rescue the ignorant locals. And the most sickening part was watching my in-laws happily play along. Vivian stepped into the video frame wearing a wide-brimmed designer sun hat and a smile so wide it looked painful. She clinked her glass against Greg's, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just insulted her entire lineage. She had sold her own dignity and committed federal wire fraud just for a temporary seat at a table where she would only ever be viewed as a punchline. Jamal was hovering near the edge of Greg's circle, wearing a flashy tailored suit that was undoubtedly paid for with the stolen money from my household account. He was holding a drink and nodding seriously, trying desperately to interject into the investors' conversations. I watched him attempt to hand a glossy business card to a man with a silver Rolex, pitching his ridiculous crypto investment firm. The investor took the card with a tight, dismissive smile and immediately turned his back on Jamal, treating him exactly like the nuisance he was. Jamal looked embarrassed for a split second before puffing his chest out again, pretending he belonged in their tax bracket. Then the camera swung toward the catering buffet and I spotted Terrence. He had clearly just arrived from the steakhouse disaster. He did not look triumphant. He did not look like the commanding head of the household he loved to pretend to be. He looked like a man walking directly to the electric chair. His tie was loosened, his collar was completely soaked with sweat, and he was standing near the ice sculpture, furiously typing on his phone. He was frantically trying to log into the corporate banking portal, hitting a brick wall of revoked access credentials over and over again. He glanced up at his mother, his eyes wide with sheer terror, but he was too cowardly to walk over and pull her aside. He was too terrified to tell Vivian that the $15,000 he stole was gone. My business accounts were locked, and their golden ticket had just bounced. He was trapped in the facade, forced to stand there and drink champagne while knowing he had $0 to his name. Greg stepped up to a small wooden podium that had been placed near the edge of the natural springs. He tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the chatter of the investors, bringing the party to a polite silence. Keisha moved to the very front row, holding her phone high to capture her husband's big moment. I leaned forward in the leather seat of my car, tapping the glass partition separating me from the driver. Take the next left onto the county road, I instructed, my voice perfectly calm. We are 2 minutes away. Thank you all for coming out today. Greg began, his voice carrying over the gentle breeze coming off the lake. When I first saw this property, I saw a tragic waste. I saw 50 acres of untapped potential, completely neglected by people who lack the vision, the education, and the capital to bring it into the modern era. My hands formed tight fists in my lap. He was talking about a black man who worked until his fingers literally bled to leave something valuable for his children, and Greg had the audacity to call it a tragic waste. But today, Greg continued, sweeping his arm dramatically toward the pristine water. We correct that mistake. We bring civilization and modern luxury to this outdated plot of dirt. Lakeside Eco Resort will be the absolute crown jewel of this county. A place for our elite clients to escape the city, built right over those useless mud springs. We are elevating the demographic, elevating the land, and elevating the standard of living. The investors clapped politely. Vivian clapped the loudest, beaming with absolute pride as her son-in-law openly disrespected her own community. I did them a favor, Greg added with a smug, arrogant laugh. I gave them a quick, quiet payout, and in return, we get to build an empire. The bulldozers you see parked right over there by the tree line are fueled and ready. By tomorrow morning, we start clearing the brush and paving over the past. I looked up from my phone screen and out the tinted window of the SUV. The car was rapidly approaching the property line. Greg had set up a newly paved temporary entrance for his guests, marked by white balloons and a valet stand. Do not take the main entrance, I told the driver, pointing toward a narrow break in the trees. Take the old dirt access road, the one my grandfather used for his tractor. It runs directly parallel to the catering tents. The driver hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the unpaved, dusty path, but a quick glance in the rearview mirror at my expression told him not to argue. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. Hit the gas. I instructed, my tone dropping to a cold, absolute command. Do not slow down until we reach the main lawn. On my phone screen, Greg raised his glass high into the air, the afternoon sun catching the expensive liquid. He flashed a blinding, victorious smile at his wealthy friends. To the future, Greg declared, waiting for the thunderous applause. But the applause never came, because at that exact moment my driver slammed his heavy boot on the accelerator. The massive, sleek black SUV roared off the pavement and hit the dry, loose dirt of the old tractor path at 50 miles an hour. A massive, towering cloud of thick brown dust and gravel erupted behind the tires, blowing violently across the lawn, sweeping directly over the pristine white linen tables, the silver chafing dishes, and the horrified faces of Greg's wealthy investors. The heavy cloud of brown dust washed over the pristine white catering tents like a tidal wave of reality. I watched through the tinted windows of the SUV as wealthy investors coughed and sputtered, waving their hands frantically to clear the air. Crystal champagne flutes were instantly coated in a thick layer of grime. The pretentious string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the cellist hacking violently as the cloud enveloped them. My driver brought the vehicle to a smooth, calculated halt right beside the wooden podium where Greg had been giving his arrogant speech. I waited exactly 10 seconds, letting the dust settle and the panic peak before I opened my door. I stepped out of the car, and the entire party froze. I was not the broken, weeping woman they had left locked out on a porch just hours ago. I was wearing a flawless, vibrant, emerald green tailored suit that contrasted sharply with the dull, dusty beige tones now covering their entire event. My hair was perfectly styled, my posture was impeccable, and despite the fresh surgical incisions hidden beneath my clothes, I moved with absolute predatory grace. I looked like a woman who owned the ground she walked on because I did. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of investors coughing and the gentle lap of the lake water against the shore. Then Vivian recovered her senses. Her wide-brimmed designer sun hat was covered in dirt, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched toward me, her heels sinking into the soft grass, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Security! Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. Get this woman off the property right now. She is a trespasser. Grab her and escort her to the main road. Two burly private security guards in black polo shirts stepped forward, but I did not even flinch. I leveled a glare at them so cold they instantly stopped in their tracks. If you touch me, I will have you arrested for assault on my own property, I stated clearly, my voice carrying across the silent lawn. Terrence rushed forward, sweating profusely, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He was desperate to maintain the illusion of control in front of Greg and the wealthy investors. He reached out, attempting to physically grab my upper arm to physically pull me away from the crowd. Aisha, what is wrong with you? Terrence hissed through his teeth. Stop embarrassing the family. Get back in the car before Greg presses charges. You are acting completely unhinged. I smoothly stepped back, dodging his grip with effortless precision. Do not put your hands on me, Terrence, I said, keeping my voice low but perfectly audible to the people standing nearby. You do not have the funds in your bank account to pay for my dry cleaning, let alone dictate where I stand. Terrence physically recoiled, his face draining of all color. He knew I was talking about the locked corporate accounts. He knew he was utterly broke, and the reminder stripped away every ounce of false bravado he possessed. He shrunk back into the shadow of his mother, completely neutralized. I bypassed my spineless husband and my screeching mother-in-law, walking straight up to the wooden podium. Greg was frantically dusting off his ruined linen suit, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. He looked at me with absolute contempt, trying to reassert his dominance in front of his wealthy friends. What is this, Aisha? Greg sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. A bitter ex-wife tantrum. Are you really so petty that you had to come here and throw dust on my guests just because you are mad? I bought your little mud pit for pennies. You are making a fool of yourself. The deal is done. The land is mine. Keisha stepped up right next to her white husband, playing the loyal, supportive sidekick. She glared at me, her hands planted firmly on her hips. You are just jealous that Greg actually has the vision to do something with this place, Keisha announced proudly. You and your grandfather just let this land rot. Greg is bringing real money to the family. You need to leave before you ruin his big day. I did not argue with Keisha. I did not raise my voice at Greg. I simply reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a single folded piece of thick, watermarked paper. I held it out to Greg. I am not here to throw a tantrum, Greg, I said smoothly. I am here to deliver a document you desperately need to read before you make the worst financial mistake of your entire privileged life. Greg laughed, a loud forced sound designed to show his investors that he was in complete control of the situation. He refused to take the paper from my hand, treating me like a nuisance rather than a threat. I am not reading whatever fake legal notice you printed off the internet, Aisha. I have the signed, notarized deed. I bought this land fair and square from your mother-in-law. You have absolutely no legal standing here. Now take your little piece of paper and get off my resort. I calmly placed the document directly onto the center of his wooden podium. I smoothed it out with my hand, making sure the official state seal at the top was perfectly visible. That is a copy of a state conservation easement, I explained, my voice ringing out clear and steady so every single investor in the front row could hear me. 6 months ago, I transferred the legal deed of this entire 50-acre property into a blind trust. And then I sold the permanent development and water rights to the State Environmental Conservation Board for $3.5 million. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. I could hear the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. Greg stared at me, his smug smile freezing on his face, his brain struggling to process the words I had just spoken. I leaned in, slightly locking eyes with him. That means this land is a federally protected ecological site, Greg. You cannot subdivide it. You cannot pave it. And you absolutely cannot build a luxury eco-resort on it. Vivian did not sell you my land. She sold you a forged, outdated, worthless piece of paper. That is a lie, Vivian screamed from the background, stepping forward in a panic. She is lying, Greg. Do not listen to her. I gave you the real deed. Greg looked down at the paper on the podium. His eyes scanned the official state seals, the signatures, the permanent restriction clauses. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face as the reality of his $2 million commercial loan crashed down upon him. He had leveraged his entire company against a property that was legally untouchable. "This is a trick," Greg stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous arrogance. "You fabricated this. My title company would have seen this in the public records. Your shady title company pushed the paperwork through without doing a proper survey. Because you were rushing to steal this land before I woke up from surgery," I corrected him sharply. "You let your arrogance blind you to basic due diligence. You thought you were outsmarting a naive black woman, but you just bankrupted yourself." I did not argue further. I did not need to. I simply stood up straight, pulled back the sleeve of my emerald blazer, and tapped the glass face of my gold watch. Right on cue, a low, heavy rumble began to echo in the distance. The ground beneath our feet started to vibrate slightly. Greg looked up from the podium, a desperate, wild spark of hope returning to his eyes. He pointed toward the trees. "You hear that? Those are my bulldozers. My crew is here. I own this land, and we are breaking ground today no matter what your little fake piece of paper says." I smiled, a slow, freezing expression that made Keisha instinctively step back from me. The heavy grinding sound of diesel engines was getting louder, but it was not coming from the tree line where his construction crew had parked. It was coming straight up the newly paved main access road, and mixed with the roar of the engines was the distinct, piercing wail of police sirens. "Those are not your bulldozers, Greg," I said softly. The heavy grinding roar of diesel engines grew deafening, but it was accompanied by the unmistakable piercing wail of police sirens. Through the settling brown dust that had just coated the luxury catering tents, 3 massive green and white SUVs tore up the newly paved access road. Their light bars flashed blinding red and blue against the afternoon sun, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the faces of Greg's wealthy investors. The lead vehicle slammed on its brakes, right at the edge of the manicured lawn, the tires tearing deep, ugly gashes into the pristine grass my grandfather had maintained for decades. The doors swung open before the vehicle even fully settled. 4 state environmental conservation officers stepped out, their green uniforms, crisp, their faces set in expressions of absolute authority. Behind them, 2 fully armed state troopers emerged from the trailing vehicles, resting their hands casually on their utility belts. The pretentious string quartet, which had been attempting to resume playing, went dead silent. The investors in the front row started backing away, suddenly very concerned about being associated with whatever was about to happen. The lead conservation officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying temples, did not look at the champagne flutes or the ice sculptures. He marched straight past the catering buffet and pointed a commanding finger toward the tree line where Greg's hired construction crew was idling their bulldozers. "Power those machines down immediately," the officer bellowed, his voice carrying the heavy, unquestionable weight of state law. "I want keys out of the ignitions and operators on the ground right now." Greg's face shifted from shocked confusion to indignant, explosive rage. He was a man who had spent his entire life insulated by old money and racial privilege. He was completely unaccustomed to being told no, especially on a property he believed he had rightfully purchased. He threw his soiled linen jacket back and marched directly toward the lead officer, closing the distance with aggressive, entitled strides. "Excuse me," Greg shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "What exactly do you think you are doing, crashing a private corporate event? You are trespassing on private property. I have state politicians in these tents who will have your badge before you can even get back in your vehicle." The lead officer did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply looked Greg up and down with the kind of weary contempt reserved for people who think money exempts them from the law. "Are you the individual responsible for bringing heavy excavation machinery onto this site?" the officer asked, his tone flat and administrative. "I am the owner of this site," Greg barked, puffing his chest out. "I am the managing director of Lakeside Development. I just purchased these 50 acres from my wife's family, and we are breaking ground on a commercial resort today. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to halt a legally permitted construction project on private land." Greg spun around frantically searching the crowd until he locked eyes with Vivian. She was standing frozen near the dessert table, her designer sun hat trembling in her hands. Terrence was practically trying to merge his body with a wooden tent pole, desperately trying to become invisible. "Vivian, get over here and tell this man we finalized the sale," Greg ordered, snapping his fingers at his mother-in-law like she was the hired help. "Tell him you transferred the deed to my company." Vivian took a hesitant, terrified step forward, but she could not force her mouth to form any words. She looked at the state troopers, and I saw the exact moment her church lady facade completely evaporated. She suddenly realized that the fake notary stamp she had used to steal my land was not just a clever family hustle. It was a fast track to a federal indictment. Keisha, ever the loyal and deeply ignorant wife, marched up to stand beside Greg. "Officer, my husband just told you he owns this property," Keisha snapped, crossing her arms and attempting to use her proximity to Greg's whiteness as a shield. "My mother sold it to him. We have the paperwork. You are harassing us, and we will be filing a massive lawsuit against your department." The lead officer let out a long, tired sigh. He pulled a thick clipboard from under his arm. "Sir, ma'am, I do not care what kind of internal family transaction you think you conducted. This specific plot of land, all 50 acres, is registered with the State Environmental Conservation Board as a highly protected Class 1 ecological site. The natural freshwater springs running beneath this topsoil are protected by federal mandate." Greg let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He reached inside the breast pocket of his ruined linen jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of thick, official-looking paper. It was the forged deed, the very document Vivian had created to steal my inheritance. "You are completely incompetent," Greg sneered, physically shoving the forged deed directly into the officer's chest. "Look at the title. Look at the signatures. I bought this land free and clear. There are no conservation restrictions listed on this deed. I have the commercial permits pulled and approved by the county. Now get off my land before I have my private security forcefully remove you." I stood perfectly still near the wooden podium, my arms crossed over my emerald green blazer, watching the execution unfold. Greg was so blinded by his own arrogance that he was literally handing the state authorities the physical evidence of Vivian's wire fraud. The lead officer caught the paperwork before it hit the ground. He slowly unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the forged signatures, the fake notary stamp, and the outdated property boundaries. He read it in complete silence for an agonizing 30 seconds. The wealthy investors standing nearby began to murmur nervously among themselves. They were sharks, and they could smell blood in the water. The officer looked up from the fraudulent deed. He did not look angry. He looked at Greg with absolute clinical pity. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden dead silence of the lawn, "this deed is fraudulent." Greg froze. "What did you just say?" "This document is a complete fabrication," the officer stated, holding the paper up. "It lacks the mandatory state conservation riders that were legally attached to this property 6 months ago by the actual current owner. The county permits you pulled were automatically flagged and revoked by our department at 6 in the morning because they were filed using falsified property parameters. That is impossible." Greg stammered, the arrogant redness in his face rapidly draining away, leaving behind a sickly, chalky white. "I wired $300,000 to my mother-in-law for this title. The bank verified it." "Then your bank failed to do a manual title search on a protected ecological zone," the officer replied, stepping closer to Greg. "But that is a civil matter between you and whoever sold you this fake piece of paper. My concern is the environmental law you are currently threatening to break." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but the officer cut him off, raising a stern hand. "Let me make this perfectly clear to you, Mr. Lakeside Development," the officer commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. "This land belongs to an irrevocable blind trust. It is a federally protected watershed. If those bulldozers you brought move 1 single inch of dirt on this property, if a single blade of protected grass is torn up by your machinery, you will be personally cited for a violation of the Clean Water Act. You are facing an immediate $500,000 fine, the complete seizure of your construction equipment, and I will personally walk you to my vehicle in handcuffs for federal environmental crimes. The words hung in the air heavy and absolute. Federal crimes, $500,000 fine, fraudulent deed. Greg stood entirely paralyzed. His brain was desperately trying to calculate the mathematical nightmare he had just walked into. He had leveraged his entire development company. He had taken out a $2 million high-interest loan from aggressive private lenders. He had brought his most important, wealthiest investors to this property to show off his brilliant acquisition, and he had tied it all to a fake document sold to him by a woman who thought she was smarter than the law. The crystal champagne flute Greg was holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the grass and shattered against a hidden rock, the sharp, brittle sound echoing across the silent lawn like a gunshot. Greg slowly turned his head. His eyes bypassed the state troopers. He bypassed the murmuring, panicking investors who were already pulling out their phones to call their financial advisors. He bypassed Keisha, who was staring at him with her mouth hanging open in sheer horror. Greg looked directly at Vivian and Terrence. His face was completely devoid of color, pale with a deep, visceral terror that comes from realizing your entire life is about to be completely dismantled. He knew his investors were going to demand their money back immediately. He knew the $2 million loan was going to default. And he knew exactly who had handed him the fake deed. Vivian met his gaze and took a trembling step backward, bumping into the catering table. Terrence looked like he was about to vomit. Greg opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to demand answers from the in-laws he had just enriched. But before he could utter a single word, a new voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, officer." Everyone turned. From the black car that had followed the state troopers up the dirt road, a woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out. It was Sylvia, my ruthless family law attorney. She held a thick, heavy manila folder in her hands, and she was smiling a smile that promised absolute destruction. I watched Greg's entire arrogant world crumble in real time. The state troopers stood by with their hands resting casually on their belts, forming an impenetrable wall between the heavy machinery and my family's ancestral land. Greg was gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the dock. His wealthy investors were already pulling out their phones, their faces tight with fury, demanding to know where their money was and who was going to take the loss. I did not give Greg a second to recover. I stepped right up to the podium, unzipping my leather handbag. I pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal packet bearing the authentic raised seal of the state. I did not hand it to Greg. I handed it directly to the most prominent investor standing in the front row, a man with a silver Rolex who looked ready to commit murder. "This is the actual, legally binding deed to this property," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "6 months ago, I placed this land into a blind trust and sold the development rights to the state to protect the natural springs. It is a permanent conservation easement. What Greg purchased from my mother-in-law was a poorly forged photocopy of a voided document." The investor quickly scanned the paperwork, his eyes widening as he read the ironclad legal restrictions. He shoved the packet hard into Greg's chest. "You arrogant fool," the investor spat. "You leveraged our capital on a stolen protected wetland without running a basic commercial title search. I am pulling my funding immediately, and my lawyers will be contacting you before the sun goes down." The investors turned in unison, marching across the ruined, dusty lawn toward their luxury vehicles. Greg reached out desperately, trying to grab the man's arm. "Wait! We can fix this. I have assets. I can liquidate." The investor yanked his arm away with pure disgust. "You are bankrupt, Greg. You just blew $2 million of borrowed money on a piece of dirt you cannot even pitch a tent on." The sound of expensive car doors slamming shut echoed across the property. Greg was left standing alone at the podium, gripping the real deed in his shaking hands. The color in his face shifted from pale white to a deep, dangerous purple. His chest heaved as the mathematical reality of his situation crushed him. He had taken out a $2 million commercial loan at a predatory interest rate. He had absolutely no way to pay it back. Greg turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Vivian. She was trembling, gripping Terrence's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. "You!" Greg roared, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. He lunged off the podium, marching directly toward my mother-in-law. "You stole $300,000 from me. You handed me a fake deed and told me your worthless son needed capital. You just destroyed my entire company." Vivian shrank back, raising her hands in a pathetic attempt to defend herself. "Greg, please, there has been a terrible mistake. I did not know about any conservation board. I thought I was doing what was best for the family." "Do not talk to me about family," Greg screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You are a common thief. You committed fraud and you dragged me down with you. I am going to lose my business. I am going to lose everything." Keisha immediately jumped in front of her mother, her designer heels sinking into the mud. "Do not you ever speak to my mother like that," Keisha yelled, waving her manicured finger in her husband's face. "She made a mistake. You are supposed to be a provider, Greg. Fix it." Greg looked at his wife as if he had never seen her before. A harsh, manic laugh erupted from his chest. "Fix it!" he shouted, stepping so close to Keisha that she flinched. "There is no fixing a $2 million default, Keisha. It is gone. The house is going to be seized. Your credit cards are going to be cut off by morning. You think I can afford your luxury lifestyle now? You think we have money? We are completely broke because your criminal mother just conned me out of my last available line of credit." Keisha's jaw dropped. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage shattered instantly in front of everyone. "You are lying," she stammered, tears springing to her eyes. "You have a trust fund." "I do not have a trust fund," Greg screamed back, completely abandoning any sense of pride. "I leveraged everything to build this resort. Everything." Terrence finally found a shred of courage and stepped between his sister and his brother-in-law. "Hey, man, back up," Terrence ordered, putting a hand on Greg's shoulder. "You need to calm down and stop disrespecting my family." Greg forcefully shoved Terrence backward, sending my husband stumbling into the dirt. "Do not touch me, you pathetic mooch," Greg spat. "You let your mother steal your wife's property just to fund Jamal's delusions. You are exactly like them, a family of leeches." The entire lawn descended into total chaos. Keisha was sobbing hysterically, realizing she was about to lose her mansion and her country club membership. Terrence was brushing dirt off his suit, completely humiliated by another man in front of state law enforcement. Jamal was furiously texting on his phone, likely trying to figure out how to hide the $300,000 before Greg sued him for it. Vivian was backed into a corner, her eyes darting around wildly like a trapped animal. She saw the state troopers watching the domestic dispute unfold, their hands resting on their radios. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one immediately. Vivian pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "This is her fault!" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing across the water. "Aisha set us up. She planned this entire thing to destroy us. She knew Greg wanted the land, and she deliberately hid the conservation details so we would fall into a trap. Arrest her. She is the one who manipulated this entire sale out of spite." I did not even blink. I just smiled, watching her dig her hole 10 feet deeper. I did not have to defend myself because Sylvia was already walking across the grass. My attorney bypassed the screaming family members and stepped right up to Vivian, holding a thick, heavy manila folder. Sylvia looked at my mother-in-law with the kind of predatory calm that made grown men tremble in family court. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell. "Actually, Vivian," Sylvia said smoothly, cutting through the shouting with absolute precision, "we are not here to discuss the land anymore. We are here to discuss the fake notary stamp you used to authorize the interstate wire transfer." Sylvia stood on the ruined grass of my grandfather's land, looking like an executioner in a tailored gray suit. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened her thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of banking records highlighted in bright yellow ink. The state troopers, who were previously focused entirely on Greg and his bulldozers, now turned their full attention to my attorney. Vivian tried to quickly adjust her posture, attempting to summon that familiar arrogant church lady persona she used to intimidate people. She smoothed down her dust-covered dress and forced a hollow laugh. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Vivian said, her voice shaking violently. "This is a private family transaction. You have absolutely no right to be here." Sylvia ignored her completely and turned directly to the lead state trooper. "Officer, my firm represents Aisha in her divorce and asset protection proceedings. In the course of tracking my client's stolen property, we subpoenaed the wire transfer logs from Lakeside Development, LLC. The $300,000 Greg paid for this fraudulent deed was routed across state lines into a holding account." Greg whipped his head around to glare at Vivian. "You told me to wire that money to a secure escrow service." "It was not an escrow service," Sylvia stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air. "It was a dummy account registered to a fake notary public. To process a real estate transaction without the actual property owner present, you need a licensed notary to verify the signature. Vivian forged my client's name, but she needed a stamp to make it look legitimate to Greg's shady title company. So she used a fake notary identification number." Sylvia pulled out a blown-up photograph of the final page of the forged deed. She pointed a manicured finger at the blue ink stamp at the bottom. "We ran the notary identification number through the state database." Sylvia continued. "It does not exist. But we did track the IP address used to order the custom rubber stamp online, and we tracked the routing numbers for the dummy bank account where Greg's $300,000 was deposited." Sylvia slowly turned her lethal gaze toward the edge of the catering tent. Both the IP address and the bank account belonged to Jamal. The entire lawn fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Every single pair of eyes snapped toward Jamal. He was standing near the shattered ice sculpture, holding a plate of catered shrimp, wearing the expensive tailored suit he had undoubtedly bought with my stolen money. The color drained out of Jamal's face so fast he looked physically ill. The state troopers immediately took a step toward him, their hands instinctively moving to their duty belts. Federal wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud across state lines. Sylvia listed the charges with chilling precision. That carries a mandatory minimum of 3 to 5 years in federal prison. The tough guy persona Jamal had spent his entire life cultivating vanished in less than a second. He was a 30-year-old man who had never faced a single real consequence because his mother had always bailed him out. But Vivian could not bail him out of a federal indictment. Jamal dropped his plate. The shrimp scattered into the dirt. He threw his hands up in the air and immediately backed away from his mother, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. "I did not do it," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking loudly. "She made me do it. I did not know it was a federal crime. She told me to order the stamp online. She said it was just family business and that Aisha would not care. I just opened the bank account because she told me to. It was her idea. All of it was her idea." Vivian gasped, clutching her designer pearls as if she had just been stabbed in the chest. Her golden child, the son she had sacrificed my marriage and my ancestral land for, had not even hesitated to throw her directly under the bus the second he saw a police badge. "You ungrateful little boy!" Vivian shrieked, completely losing her mind. She lunged forward, her heels sinking into the mud, and swung her arm with all her might. The slap echoed across the silent property like a gunshot. Vivian struck Jamal squarely across the jaw, her heavy rings scratching his cheek. Jamal stumbled backward, holding his face, looking at his mother with pure shock. The state troopers did not wait another second. They moved in rapidly, grabbing Vivian by the arms and pulling her away from Jamal. Vivian started thrashing and screaming, her wide-brimmed hat flying off her head and landing in a puddle of spilled champagne. "You are arresting the wrong person," she wailed, pointing desperately at me. "Aisha set this up. She is the one destroying her own family. Nobody was listening to her. The troopers were already advising her of her rights, while another officer detained Jamal, who was actively sobbing and begging them to look at his phone to prove Vivian orchestrated the whole thing. While the criminal implosion was happening near the catering tents, an equally devastating financial massacre was occurring by the wooden podium. Greg's wealthy investors had heard enough. The man with the silver Rolex, the lead investor who had funded a massive portion of Greg's commercial loan, was pacing back and forth on his cell phone. He hung up and marched directly up to Greg, jabbing a rigid finger into Greg's chest. "My legal team is freezing your operating accounts right now," the investor growled, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. "You brought us out here to celebrate a $2 million investment on a property you do not even own. You did not do a single shred of due diligence because you were too busy trying to scam your own in-laws." Greg held his hands up defensively, sweating through his ruined linen suit. "Give me a week. I can liquidate some of my other properties. I can make you whole. I promise." "You do not have a week," the investor fired back. "The terms of our bridge loan clearly state that in the event of gross negligence, we can immediately call in the debt. We demand our money back by Friday at 5 in the afternoon. If that $2 million is not sitting in our accounts, we are piercing the corporate veil. We will seize your personal assets. We will take your house. We will take your luxury cars, and we will gut every single personal investment account you have." Keisha, who had been standing frozen in horror, suddenly let out a loud, high-pitched wail. "Greg, you cannot let them take the house. Call your father. Ask him for an advance on your trust fund. We cannot be broke, Greg. We cannot live like regular people." Greg spun around and screamed right in his wife's face, a vein popping in his forehead. "My father cut me off 2 years ago, Keisha. There is no trust fund. The only money we have was tied up in this resort. It is gone. Everything is gone because your criminal mother handed me a fake deed." Keisha collapsed onto her knees in the dirt, ruining her designer dress, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her impending poverty crashed down on her. "The perfect, arrogant marriage she loved to flaunt in my face was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and it had just been blown away by the wind." I stood near the black SUV, entirely untouched by the chaos, the dirt, and the screaming. My vibrant emerald suit was spotless. My posture was perfectly straight. I had not raised my voice once. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Terrence. My soon-to-be ex-husband was standing alone in the middle of the wreckage. His mother was currently being handcuffed by a state trooper. His brother was crying in the back of a police cruiser. His sister was sobbing in the mud about losing her mansion. And Greg, the man he idolized, was facing complete and total financial ruin. Terrence had $15,000 stolen from my household account to his name, and absolutely nothing else. His corporate cards were empty. His safety net was gone. Terrence looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Tears were welling up and spilling over his eyelashes, tracking through the thick brown dust covering his face. In that single fleeting moment, the delusion finally broke. He realized exactly what he had done. He had thrown away a loyal, loving, successful wife. He had thrown away his financial stability and his peaceful life to protect a family that was currently tearing each other apart like wild animals in the mud. "Aisha, please," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking as he took a pathetic, trembling step toward me. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had just realized he walked off a cliff. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I simply looked at the man who had locked me out of my own home while I was bleeding from surgery. I gave him a slow, radiant, victorious smile. I turned my back on him, stepped into the cool, air-conditioned leather back seat of the black SUV, and smoothly pulled the door shut. "Take me back to the city," I told the driver. The heavy tires crunched against the gravel as we drove away, leaving Terrence standing utterly alone in the dust of his own destruction. It has been exactly 30 days since I climbed into the back of that black SUV and left my treacherous in-laws standing in the dust of their own spectacular downfall. 30 days of absolute, uninterrupted silence on my end, while my attorney Sylvia systematically dismantled their lives behind closed doors. Sylvia had filed the divorce papers, secured the emergency financial injunctions, and handed over every piece of evidence regarding the forged deed to the federal authorities. Terrence had been living out of a suitcase in Vivian's guest bedroom, his access to my corporate accounts permanently severed. Greg was currently fighting a losing battle against his furious investors, dodging process servers and frantically trying to liquidate his remaining assets before the bank seized his properties. They were all in a complete and total financial freefall, desperately trying to keep their heads above water while the gravity of their crimes pulled them under. And yet, because the illusion of status was the only thing Vivian valued more than oxygen, she still insisted on hosting the annual Thanksgiving dinner for the entire extended family. She was determined to maintain the facade of the wealthy, respectable matriarch, serving up roasted turkey and candied yams to dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had absolutely no idea that a federal indictment was currently sitting on a prosecutor's desk with her name on it. I was, of course, explicitly uninvited from this holiday gathering, which is exactly why I decided to show up. I parked my luxury car halfway down the pristine suburban street, ensuring Vivian would not spot my vehicle from her living room windows. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, wearing a stunning tailored burnt orange coat over a sleek black dress. I did not look like a woman mourning the end of her marriage. I looked like a woman who had just conquered the world, bringing a completely different kind of harvest to the table. I walked up the driveway and let myself in through the unlocked front door. The house was loud, filled with the booming sounds of a football game on the television, the clinking of silverware, and the overlapping voices of extended relatives sharing stories. The heavy, familiar scents of baked macaroni and cheese-collared greens and warm spices filled the air, a stark contrast to the toxic reality rotting beneath the surface of this family. I bypassed the crowded living room and walked silently down the hallway, stopping right at the wide-arched entrance of the formal dining room. The scene unfolding in front of me was a masterpiece of manufactured joy. The long dining table was packed with guests. At the far end, Terrence was standing up holding an electric carving knife over a massive roasted turkey. He was forcing a tight, unconvincing smile, trying to play the role of the successful, confident provider for the visiting relatives. Then he looked up and made direct eye contact with me. Terrence froze completely. His finger slipped off the trigger of the electric knife, the loud whirring sound dying abruptly. His jaw dropped, all the fake confidence draining from his face in an instant, replaced by sheer, undisguised panic. Following his gaze, the rest of the room slowly turned toward the archway. The lively conversations sputtered and died one by one, until the dining room was completely enveloped in a suffocating, heavy silence. I took a moment to slowly survey the room, letting my eyes linger on the primary architects of my attempted ruin. Greg was sitting halfway down the table, and he looked like a walking ghost. The arrogant, sun-tanned real estate developer who had sneered at my grandfather's legacy just 4 weeks ago was entirely gone. His skin was a sickly ashen gray. His expensive haircut was unkempt, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot with dark bruised bags hanging underneath them. He looked like a man who had not slept a full hour since the state troopers showed up at the lake house. Keisha sat as far away from her white husband as physically possible without leaving the table entirely. She was glaring at the side of his head with pure, unadulterated venom, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The facade of their perfect, wealthy marriage had completely decomposed. She was furious that her luxury lifestyle was evaporating, blaming the man she had previously treated like a god. Jamal was seated near the kitchen door, sweating profusely into his expensive shirt collar. He kept wiping his forehead with a cloth napkin, his eyes darting nervously toward the front windows every few seconds, like he expected a SWAT team to burst through the glass. He knew the feds were auditing his bank accounts. He knew he was standing on the trap door of a prison cell. Vivian stood up from her seat at the opposite end of the table. She was wearing an immaculate tailored church dress, her hair perfectly styled, desperately trying to project absolute authority in front of her older siblings and cousins. Her hands gripped the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "What are you doing in my house, Aisha?" Vivian demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are not welcome here. Get out of my sight right now before I call the police." A murmur of shock rippled through the extended relatives. They exchanged confused glances, entirely unaware of the war that had been raging behind the scenes. To them, I was just Terrence's successful wife. I did not flinch at Vivian's threat. I smiled warmly and nodded to Terrence's favorite aunt, who was sitting near the centerpiece. "Happy Thanksgiving, Auntie Denise. Your hair looks beautiful today." Auntie Denise blinked clearly, sensing the lethal, undeniable energy radiating off me, and gave a slow, hesitant nod in return. I turned my attention back to my mother-in-law, my voice smooth and perfectly projected so every single person in the room could hear me. "Call them Vivian," I challenged, stepping fully into the dining room. "We both know the federal authorities are already building a very thick file with your name on it. But I highly doubt you want to discuss your interstate wire fraud charges in front of the sweet potato pie." A collective audible gasp went up from the table. Auntie Denise dropped her fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. Terrence slammed his hands down on the table, his voice cracking with desperation. "Aisha, please, just leave. Do not do this today. Do not do this in front of everyone." I ignored his pathetic begging. I walked with deliberate, unbothered elegance straight toward the head of the table. I reached out and firmly pulled out the heavy oak chair sitting right next to Terrence. I sat down smoothly, crossing my legs, completely claiming the space. I took my heavy designer leather tote bag and placed it squarely on the pristine white lace tablecloth right next to the gravy boat. Vivian started hyperventilating, pointing a shaking finger at her son. "Terrence, remove her from this house immediately. Make her leave." Terrence was too paralyzed by fear and financial ruin to move a single muscle. He just stared at my designer bag, knowing exactly what kind of hell I was capable of bringing into this room. The entire extended family was dead silent, too stunned to intervene, waiting with bated breath for my next move. I slowly unzipped the gold hardware of my tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of sealed legal envelopes. I placed them on the table with a solid, echoing thud. I looked directly at my mother-in-law, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face, as I prepared to dismantle the last remaining shreds of her pristine reputation. "I didn't come for the dry turkey, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "I came to deliver the sides." I placed my hand on the top envelope, maintaining unyielding eye contact with Vivian, and firmly slid the first thick white packet across the mahogany table, stopping it right in front of Terrence. Terrence stared at the thick white envelope resting on the pristine lace tablecloth right in front of him. His hands were trembling so violently that when he finally reached out to pick it up, he knocked over his crystal water goblet. The ice spilled across the table, soaking into the fabric, but nobody in the dining room moved a muscle to clean it up. The entire extended family sat in suffocating silence, watching him tear through the heavy paper seal. He pulled out the stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the bold print at the top of the page, and I saw the exact second his heart dropped into his stomach. They were the finalized divorce decrees rushed through the court system with lethal efficiency by my attorney, Sylvia. "You cannot do this," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking as he flipped wildly through the pages. "Aisha, you cannot just cut me out like this. We built a life together. I am entitled to half of that agency. I am entitled to half of whatever the state paid you for that land." I leaned back in my heavy oak chair, crossing my arms over my burnt orange coat. "You are entitled to absolutely nothing, Terrence. Sylvia made sure the judge saw the bank records showing you completely drained our joint household account to pay for your brother's luxury car lease while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. The judge viewed that as a deliberate dissipation of marital assets. You abandoned your financial responsibilities, which meant you forfeited any claim to my business revenue." and the $3.5 million from the State Conservation Board was deposited directly into a blind trust that predates our marriage. You do not get a single dime. Terrence dropped the papers onto his plate, his face burying into his hands as a quiet, pathetic sob escaped his throat. He had thrown away a loving wife, a beautiful home, and a lavish lifestyle, all because he lacked the spine to stand up to his mother. Now he was walking away with nothing but the clothes on his back and half the debt of Vivian's mounting legal fees. I did not give the room a chance to process his breakdown. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out the second thick envelope, and slid it firmly down the length of the table. It stopped right next to the gravy boat directly in front of Greg. Greg stared at the envelope like it was a live explosive. His arrogant, sun-tanned face was completely devoid of color. He slowly reached out and opened it. "That is a formal civil lawsuit from my trust against your limited liability company," I stated clearly, making sure the older aunts and uncles at the table heard every single word. "You attempted to bulldoze and destroy a federally protected ecological site. You caused severe emotional and structural distress to my grandfather's legacy. My legal team is suing you for punitive damages, and we are going after every single personal asset you possess to cover the legal fees." Greg put his head down on the table, his fingers digging into his unkempt hair. He did not yell. He did not puff out his chest and brag about his wealth the way he had at the cookout 3 months ago. He was completely and utterly broken. The $2 million default had already drained him dry, and this lawsuit was the final nail in his financial coffin. Keisha could not hold up her country club facade for another second. The reality of her husband's bankruptcy had finally shattered her delusion. She slammed her hands on the table and broke down into loud, ugly, hysterical sobs, ruining her expensive makeup. "Aisha. Please, Keisha," wailed, tears streaming down her face as she looked across the turkey at me. "The investors took the house yesterday. They changed the locks. We are being officially evicted on Monday morning, and we have absolutely nowhere to go. Greg's accounts are entirely frozen. We cannot even buy groceries. You have to drop this lawsuit. We are family. You cannot put your own sister-in-law out on the street." I looked at Keisha, remembering the exact tone of her voice when she laughed through the doorbell camera, telling me to sleep on a cot while she drank my wine. I remembered the smug, righteous look on her face when she stood on the altar at her church, passing her mother tissues, while they told a congregation of 2,000 people that I had lost my mind. "You told the whole church I was crazy, Keisha," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. "Pray on it." Auntie Denise gasped out loud, clutching her napkin to her chest. The rest of the extended relatives were wide-eyed, completely paralyzed by the sheer brutality of the truth being dragged into the light. Jamal could not take the humiliation anymore. He was the golden child, the one who was supposed to be the brilliant entrepreneur saving the family, and right now he looked like a complete fool in front of all his aunts and cousins. He shoved his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. He stormed around the dining table, his fists clenched, stepping directly into my personal space to physically intimidate me. "You are just a bitter, lonely woman," Jamal spit, towering over my chair, trying to use his height to force me to back down. "You came in here just to ruin Thanksgiving because you are miserable. You think you are so smart with your little lawsuits, but you are just petty." I did not flinch. I did not stand up. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen. I set the device gently on the lace tablecloth and synced it to the small Bluetooth speaker I had slipped into my bag before leaving the hotel. "Am I a bitter woman, Jamal?" I asked, tilting my head as I looked up at his sweating, panicking face. "Or am I just the only person in this room who knows how to keep receipts? Let us listen to your voicemail from yesterday." I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. It echoed off the dining room walls, cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. "Aisha, please pick up the phone." Jamal's recorded voice whimpered through the speaker, sounding absolutely frantic and pathetic. "I need a loan. I am begging you, please. The $300,000 Mom gave me is gone. I put it into a crypto exchange and the whole platform collapsed. The guys running it vanished. The money is entirely gone, Aisha. And the feds are auditing my accounts. They know about the fake notary stamp. Please, you have to help me before they arrest me. I will do anything. I tapped the screen and stopped the audio. The entire extended family gasped in unison. Auntie Denise covered her mouth with both hands. The uncles at the end of the table stared at Jamal in absolute horror. But the most violent reaction came from Vivian. My mother-in-law had spent her entire life shielding Jamal from consequences. She had forged my signature, stolen my ancestral land, and committed federal wire fraud across state lines, just to hand him $300,000 of stolen capital. She risked a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary because she believed her golden child was finally going to build the generational wealth that would secure her status in the community. And he had lost every single penny to an internet scam. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless sound. She clutched her chest, her carefully styled hair shaking as her knees gave out. She collapsed hard into her dining chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of sheer terror and catastrophic realization. She had destroyed her oldest son's marriage, alienated her successful daughter-in-law, and guaranteed her own incarceration for absolutely nothing. The money was gone. Terrence slowly lifted his head from his hands. His bloodshot eyes darted from the Bluetooth speaker to Jamal, and then finally settled on his mother. The reality of what she had done to him finally snapped the last remaining thread of his loyalty. He had thrown away a woman who loved him, a beautiful home, and a thriving financial future, all because his mother told him Jamal was a genius who just needed a little startup capital. "You ruined my life!" Terrence screamed, his voice raw and tearing through his throat. He lunged out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger directly at Vivian's face. "You made me lock my own wife out of our house. You made me drain my bank account. You told me this was a guaranteed investment. You destroyed my entire life for him, and he blew it on a scam. Do not yell at me," Vivian shrieked back, her pristine church lady facade completely obliterating as she slammed her hands on the table. "I did this for the family. You are all ungrateful. I took the risk. You committed a federal crime, you delusional old woman!" Greg roared, suddenly finding his voice as he stood up and threw his cloth napkin into the gravy boat. "You handed me a fake deed and bankrupted my entire development firm. I am going to testify against you in federal court. I will make sure you die in a prison cell." Keisha screamed at Greg to shut his mouth. Jamal started shouting that Greg was a privileged idiot who should have done a title search. Terrence grabbed a plate of candied yams and hurled it against the wall, the ceramic shattering into 100 pieces as the family completely imploded. The dining room erupted into a deafening, vicious screaming match. Aunts and uncles were frantically pushing their chairs back, trying to escape the crossfire as the picture-perfect family tore each other to shreds right over the untouched roasted turkey. They were screaming about stolen money, fake deeds, seized houses, and federal prison time. I sat calmly at the head of the table, completely untouched by the flying debris and the vicious insults. I slowly reached out, picked up my phone, and slipped it back into my designer tote bag. I smoothed out the fabric of my burnt orange coat and stood up with perfect, unbothered grace. Over the deafening sound of their screaming, a new sound emerged from outside the house. Heavy, authoritative knocks echoed violently against the heavy oak front door, loud enough to rattle the window panes. The screaming in the dining room abruptly stopped. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway. Through the sheer curtains of the dining room windows, bright flashing red and blue lights illuminated the walls, casting a harsh, frantic glow over the ruined Thanksgiving dinner. The police had not bothered to turn off their light bars when they pulled into Vivian's pristine suburban driveway. "I did not call them," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, as I looked down at my terrified mother-in-law. "But I think it is for you, Vivian." The heavy brass knocker pounded against the wood a second time, followed by a loud, authoritative voice demanding entry. Vivian remained frozen in her dining chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling so violently that her diamond rings clinked against the china plates. Jamal let out a pathetic whimper, backing away from the windows and attempting to hide behind the heavy velvet drapes. Before anyone could move to answer, the front door was pushed open. Two local police officers stepped into the foyer, flanking a man and a woman wearing tactical vests with federal insignias across their chests. The red and blue lights from their cruisers outside cut through the evening darkness, flashing rhythmically across the pristine walls of Vivian's suburban mansion, illuminating the horrified faces of our extended relatives. Vivian swallowed hard, her throat bobbing as she desperately attempted to summon her commanding matriarch persona. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored church dress, and forced a completely hollow smile. "Officers," Vivian said, her voice shaking, but pitched high in a pathetic attempt at casual authority. "There must be some mistake. We are in the middle of our family Thanksgiving dinner. You are interrupting a private gathering." The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a completely unreadable expression, did not even blink at Vivian's performance. She stepped directly into the dining room, her eyes scanning the faces around the table before locking onto my mother-in-law. "Vivian Blackwell." The agent stated, her voice carrying the absolute, crushing weight of the law. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, forgery of legal documents, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." Auntie Denise let out a piercing shriek. The older uncles at the table scrambled out of their chairs, backing away from Vivian as if she were suddenly contagious. The pristine, upper-class reputation Vivian had spent decades cultivating within our community evaporated into thin air in less than 5 seconds. "This is absurd," Vivian cried out, taking a step backward, as the local officers moved toward her with handcuffs drawn. "I am a respected member of the community. I sit on the church board. You cannot do this to me. Greg, tell them. Tell them this is a misunderstanding over a family property dispute." Vivian looked frantically across the table at Greg, begging her wealthy white son-in-law to use his privilege to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. But Greg just stared back at her, with eyes full of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope they give you the maximum sentence." Greg spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You handed me a fake deed and destroyed my entire company. I am going to testify against you myself to make sure you never see the outside of a prison cell." As the officer secured the cold metal handcuffs around Vivian's wrists, the second federal agent moved swiftly around the large dining table, zeroing in on Jamal. "Jamal Blackwell," the agent announced, pulling a second pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and utilizing a fraudulent notary identification to facilitate an interstate financial crime." Jamal completely broke down. The 30-year-old golden child, the man who had strutted around the 4th of July cookout bragging about building generational wealth, dropped to his knees right on top of the expensive Persian rug. He started sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his hands. "I did not know," Jamal wailed, tears streaming down his face as the officer pulled his arms behind his back. "My mother made me do it. She told me to set up the bank account. She said Aisha would not care. Please, I do not want to go to jail." "Shut your mouth, Jamal!" Vivian screamed, her pristine facade shattering entirely as she thrashed against the officers holding her. "Do not say another word to them. Terrence, call my lawyer. Call the church elders. Do something." The officers did not give her another second to orchestrate her defense. They marched Vivian and Jamal out of the dining room, leading them through the grand foyer and out the front door. Through the large bay windows, the entire extended family watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Vivian and her golden child were paraded across the manicured front lawn. The neighbors had already poured out of their massive houses, standing on their porches and in their driveways, recording the spectacular downfall of the Blackwell family on their smartphones. Inside the dining room, the silence was suffocating. The magnificent roasted turkey sat completely untouched in the center of the table, growing cold, surrounded by shattered plates and spilled wine. Keisha was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, mourning the loss of her mansion and her country club status. Greg was staring blankly at the wall, a ruined, bankrupt man, realizing his life was over. Auntie Denise and the rest of the relatives were hurriedly gathering their coats and purses, eager to flee the toxic wasteland this house had become. And then there was Terrence. My soon-to-be ex-husband stood near the head of the table, his chest heaving as he stared at the flashing police lights illuminating the street. He had lost his mother. He had lost his brother. His sister was about to be evicted, and his brother-in-law was financially ruined. He had $15,000 of stolen money to his name, and his access to my thriving corporate accounts was permanently severed. He had absolutely nothing and no one left. Terrence slowly turned his head and looked at me. I was still standing perfectly composed near my heavy oak chair, my burnt orange coat immaculate, my designer tote bag resting securely on my shoulder. I was the only person in the room who had survived the implosion. In fact, I was the one who engineered it. Aisha, Terrence whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic kind of hope. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the hardwood floor just inches from my expensive heels. He literally dropped to his knees, clasping his hands together, looking up at me with tears spilling over his eyelashes. Please, Terrence begged, his voice raw and shaking. Please, Aisha. Call Sylvia. Call the police. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you gave my mother permission to sell the land. You have the power to fix this. You have the money to post their bail. We can make this right. I looked down at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I felt absolutely no pity. You are my wife, Terrence sobbed, grabbing the hem of my coat. We took vows. You are a strong black woman. You are the rock of this family. Please just be the bigger person. Do not throw away our entire marriage over a piece of land. I love you. I will do anything you want. Just save us. He was trying to use the exact same manipulative language his mother always used. He was trying to weaponize my strength, begging me to absorb their pain and clean up their criminal mess because it was my supposed duty. He wanted me to sacrifice my grandfather's legacy and my own peace just to shield them from accountability. I smoothly reached down and pulled the fabric of my coat out of his weak, trembling grasp. I smoothed the material, making sure it was completely unwrinkled, and then I locked eyes with him. You told me failures do not belong in this family, Terrence. I said, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality that chilled the room. So, I guess it is time for me to leave. I did not wait for his response. I stepped gracefully around his kneeling form, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I walked down the long hallway, passing the horrified, silent relatives who parted like the Red Sea to let me through. I walked out the front door and stepped into the crisp, cool autumn air. I breathed in deeply, the scent of the changing leaves filling my lungs, completely, washing away the toxic stench of Vivian's house. I walked down the driveway, my head held high, ignoring the staring neighbors and the flashing lights of the police cruisers. I climbed into the driver's seat of my luxury car, started the engine, and smoothly pulled away from the curb. Back inside the dining room, Terrence was left kneeling entirely alone on the floor. He could only stare blankly through the sheer curtains of the bay window, watching his mother and brother get shoved into the back of the police cruisers, completely abandoned to the consequences of their own spectacular greed. 3 months later, the sterile fluorescent lights of the county family courthouse illuminated exactly what was left of the Blackwell family. Nothing. I sat at the polished petitioner table in my tailored ivory suit, projecting nothing but absolute serenity. Across the aisle, Terrence looked like a hollowed-out shell of the man who used to confidently order expensive steaks on my corporate card. His posture was slumped, his suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and he was represented by a discount attorney who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The dominoes had fallen with spectacular, brutal efficiency since that Thanksgiving dinner. Greg had been forced into an agonizing, highly public bankruptcy. His wealthy investors had stripped him down to the studs, seizing his luxury cars, his properties, and his dignity. The moment the money evaporated, Keisha packed her designer bags and filed for divorce, abandoning the arrogant white developer she used to parade around like a trophy. She was currently living in a cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city, working a retail job she absolutely despised just to make rent. Vivian and Jamal were faring even worse. They were both facing a mandatory minimum of 3 to 5 years in federal prison for the wire fraud and forged deed. The unbreakable mother and golden child bond had shattered the second the federal prosecutors offered a plea deal. They had completely turned on each other. Jamal was testifying that Vivian masterminded the entire fraudulent scheme, and Vivian was actively providing the feds with Jamal's hidden crypto wallet records to shave months off her own sentence. They were tearing each other apart to save themselves, proving that their family loyalty only existed when there was money to steal. But Terrence was still desperately clinging to his delusion. He was sitting in this courtroom today, trying one last pathetic Hail Mary to avoid the poverty he had earned. Your Honor. Terrence's discount lawyer began standing up and straightening his tie. My client is simply asking for an equitable division of marital assets. While he recognizes that the UX design agency is in his wife's name, he provided crucial emotional and structural support during the formative years of that business. He maintained the household so she could focus on her career. Therefore, he is legally entitled to 50% of the agency's current valuation, as well as alimony, to maintain the standard of living he grew accustomed to during the marriage. I did not laugh. I just looked at Sylvia, who was sitting beside me calmly organizing a stack of glossy printed documents. She did not even wait for the judge to ask for a rebuttal. Sylvia stood up, radiating the kind of lethal courtroom dominance that made opposing counsel sweat. Your Honor, calling my client's husband a supportive partner is not just a stretch of the imagination. It is an outright fabrication bordering on perjury, Sylvia stated, her voice crisp and echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Terrence did not support the UX agency. He actively attempted to drain the marital assets to fund the fraudulent lifestyle of his brother, a man currently awaiting federal sentencing. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing deep red. Objection, his lawyer stammered. The actions of my client's extended family have no bearing on his right to marital equity. They have absolute bearing when your client uses marital funds to finance those actions, Sylvia shot back immediately. She picked up the first document and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. Exhibit A. Bank records from the morning of my client's major endometriosis surgery. While Aisha was bleeding in a hospital recovery room, Terrence completely emptied their joint checking account. He transferred exactly $15,000 to a third-party dealership to pay off a delinquent luxury car lease for his brother Jamal. He deliberately left my client with zero access to household funds while she was medically incapacitated. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for financial abuse, frowned deeply as she reviewed the highlighted bank statements. Sylvia was just getting started. She pulled out a blown-up screenshot printed on heavy cardstock. Exhibit B, Your Honor. When my client discovered the theft and demanded an explanation, this is the text message her highly supportive husband sent her. Sylvia read the text out loud, her tone dripping with surgical contempt. Jamal's luxury lease was past due. I took care of my family. You can have access to the accounts again when you come home. Apologize to my mother and sign the retroactive consent forms to sell your ancestral land. This is what happens when you do not act like a wife. The courtroom went dead silent. The judge slowly lowered the paper, her eyes narrowing as she locked a furious glare on Terrence. He shrank back into his chair, physically attempting to hide from the absolute disgust radiating from the bench. He stole $15,000 of shared capital to pay a debt that did not belong to him. Sylvia continued delivering the final crushing blow. He attempted to use financial starvation to extort my client into signing away a $3.5 million federally protected property. He is not a supportive spouse asking for fair equity. He is a financial predator asking the court to reward him for dissipation of marital assets. We are asking that his request for equity and alimony be dismissed entirely, and that he be held fully responsible for my client's legal fees due to his frivolous and malicious filings. The judge did not even need to call a recess. She slammed her gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. Mr. Blackwell, the judge said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. Your definition of acting like a husband is frankly abhorrent. Your request for equity in an agency you actively tried to sabotage is denied. Your request for alimony is denied. You will walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which appears to be absolutely nothing. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay the petitioner's legal fees in full. This court is adjourned. Terence dropped his head onto the defense table. It was a total, unmitigated massacre. He had tried to take half my empire, and he was leaving with a massive legal bill he had absolutely no way to pay. I stood up, buttoned my ivory blazer, and walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, the sound sealing the final chapter of my toxic marriage. I was standing near the elevators when I heard the frantic scuffling sound of cheap dress shoes on the marble floor. Terence came rushing out of the courtroom, his face pale and desperate. He had lost his arrogance entirely. The reality of his poverty, his fractured family, and his lonely future had finally broken him. "Aisha, wait," Terence pleaded, reaching his hand out but stopping just short of touching my sleeve. "Please." I turned to face him, my expression completely neutral. I had no anger left for this man. He was not worth the energy it took to be angry. "I am sorry," he choked out, actual tears spilling down his cheeks. "I lost everything. I lost my mom, my brother, my home. I let them get in my head. I let them convince me that I had to control you to be a real man. But I ruined my own life." I stood perfectly still, letting him speak his pathetic, overdue truth. "Tell me one thing," Terence whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at me with the desperate, pleading eyes of a drowning man. "Did you ever really love me? Or was I just a project to you?" I looked at the man standing in front of me. The man who had stood by while his mother forged my name, who had locked me out of my house, who had emptied my bank account to teach me a lesson. "I loved the man I thought you were," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "But he never existed." I turned around, stepped into the waiting elevator, and let the steel doors slide shut, leaving Terence standing completely alone in the empty courthouse hallway. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the pristine, untouched water of the natural springs. I stood on the newly expanded wraparound deck of my grandfather's lake house, breathing in the crisp, clean scent of the timber and the fresh water. I had spent the last 12 months meticulously restoring the original cabin, updating the interior with modern luxury, while completely preserving the rustic, historical charm of the exterior. There were no massive concrete foundations here. There were no arrogant white developers pouring asphalt over my heritage. The $3.5 million from the State Conservation Board had permanently secured this land as an ecological sanctuary. It had also secured my absolute financial independence forever. My UX design agency had doubled in size. I had hired a brilliant new team, acquired 3 massive corporate contracts, and expanded my operations across the coast. Without Terence draining my energy and Vivian constantly trying to pull me down, my career had skyrocketed. I was thriving in a way I had never thought possible. I turned away from the railing and looked back at the deck. I was hosting my own cookout today. There was no passive-aggressive shade being thrown over the potato salad. There were no toxic relatives demanding money or plotting to steal my assets. The air was filled with nothing but loud, genuine laughter, the smell of premium smoked brisket, and the smooth sounds of a classic R&B playlist drifting from the outdoor speakers. Julian, my fiercely loyal real estate attorney, was standing by the massive custom grill, expertly flipping a row of hot links and arguing playfully with my top lead designer about vintage cars. Sylvia was sitting at the patio table, wearing a sleek summer dress, sipping a glass of expensive imported wine, and laughing loudly at a story my best friend Chloe was telling. This was my chosen family. A circle of brilliant, supportive, deeply loyal people who celebrated my success instead of trying to tear it down for their own benefit. There was no tension here. There was no manipulation. There was just absolute unbothered peace. I walked over to the outdoor bar cart to pour myself a fresh glass of chilled champagne. As I picked up the crystal flute, my phone vibrated softly inside my designer handbag resting on the counter. I pulled the phone out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an email notification. The sender name was Terrence. I stared at the preview text displayed on the lock screen. It was a massive, rambling paragraph. Aisha, I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I have been going to therapy, and I realize how much I let my mother destroy our life. I am working at a retail store now, trying to pay off the legal debt. I miss you every single day. If you could just find it in your heart to meet me for coffee, I want to prove that I can be the man you deserve. Please give me one more chance. I did not feel a single flicker of pity. I did not feel an ounce of hesitation or regret. I did not even bother unlocking the screen to read the rest of the pathetic, desperate message. With a single, effortless swipe of my thumb, I deleted the email permanently. I dropped the phone back into my handbag, completely dismissing Terrence from my reality. I picked up my crystal glass of champagne, turned my back to the bar, and walked over to the edge of the wooden deck. I looked out over the pristine, untouched water, watching the gentle ripples catch the golden hour light. The land was safe. My future was secure. My peace was absolute. They thought they could tear me down to build themselves up. But they forgot one thing. When you try to bury a seed, you only help it grow. The ultimate lesson from Aisha's journey is that true security and self-worth must come from within, never from the validation of a toxic family or a spineless partner. When people show their true colors through betrayal and greed, you must believe them the first time. Setting unbreakable, firm boundaries isn't an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of profound self-preservation. You cannot heal in the very same environment that broke you. Sometimes the absolute best justice is simply walking away, protecting your peace, and letting manipulative people face the devastating natural consequences of their own selfish, destructive actions. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your hard-earned peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.